Out of all of the popular video game scenarios that dominate the industry, the apocalypse is perhaps the most enduring. To take away civilization allows a game to integrate the kind of frivolous murdering and pillaging that so many games make so fun as a natural and organic extension of the setting. Some games treat the apocalypse as a convenience for gameplay conventions, others treat it as a focal point of its design and to tell a story or to create a mood that only an apocalypse scenario can truly do. But even though the apocalypse is ubiquitous in the game industry, the one type that seems the most likely to happen in real life is conspicuously absent from a huge portion of these games, the nuclear apocalypse. Most games go for the zombie apocalypse because it doesn't require the artist to render vast destruction and decay, and it allows the gameplay designers to avoid the environmental issues like radiation. A zombie apocalypse most of the time is intriguing because it spares the landscape from destruction and puts it all on the people instead, so you can have a juxtaposition of a perfectly preserved environment that wouldn't look out of home in your local area, but with its survivors put in a desperate end-of-the-world survival scenario using everyday familiar locations like shopping malls for shelters, and guns and bats and swords for self-defense. A nuclear apocalypse is much more total, much more dominant and consuming. Of course, it would be remiss of me not to mention Fallout, but at least for the earlier games and New Vegas, it was a much more hopeful, optimistic view of post-nuclear life, with actual societies popping up and in the second game in New Vegas, thriving. Civilization is reaching a point where it is relatively comparable to frontier life before the war, and the citizens are less concerned with food and water as they are the political machinations of their rivals and the remnants of the government. This is why the Metro series is so notable. It's a post-nuclear apocalypse in a totally different light than gaming's most popular and long-lasting post-nuclear series. It's an apocalypse so complete and total that humans can't even breathe the air on the surface, let alone survive the grand environmental destruction and roaming packs of monsters. They live in the metro tunnels, the only structures outside of private fallout shelters able to house a large population from the invisible fire of the bombs. It's dark, filthy, full of warring factions and monsters created from radiation. This is a world that is desperate and bleak, as opposed to Fallout's quirky humor and 50s sci-fi gizmos. Even more unique and unusual is that Metro 2033 is based off of a book, a rare thing for video games. It's written by Dmitry Glukovsky in his native language of Russian, but translated to English for those in other countries. I read the book back in high school and read it again about a year ago, and it remains one of my absolute favorites. Reading it through a second time, as an adult, with a more skeptical attitude, I definitely noticed that the book has problems this last time around. The pacing can be a bit aimless and gets herky-jerky near the end. A couple chapters could be taken straight out of the book and it'd be better off without it, and the ending still feels rushed and a little unsatisfying. The atmosphere and world in the book is its strong suit. It seems like Glukovsky planned out and created the world first, and then figured out how to create a story around it second. This dimly lit, winding series of metro tunnels is thoroughly rich and believable. He went to the trouble of giving logical answers to the majority of those what do they do to survive questions that come with living underground in a metro tunnel for years at a time. The dwellers use generators and electricity for light, but keep the light dim enough that they can keep them running for extended periods. And rangers travel to the surface for gasoline. They get food from mushrooms that they can grow in the dark and even make a special tea from it, and settlements have developed and organized themselves by stations with wildly differing ideologies and laws. The book comes with this detailed overhead map of the metro systems, and you really can trace the path RTM takes after reading the book. And that's really the book's greatest achievement, that you can intuitively picture this impossibly detailed and creative world in its thick atmosphere and mood. The central story of the book ends up being its weak point, and unfortunately the same goes for the game, but we'll get to that later. For now, let's talk about how the game actually plays. Metro's closest peer isn't actually Fallout or Wasteland. It's a little-known PC exclusive series called Stalker. Stalker, also developed by an obscure Eastern European developer, is an open-world survival shooter set in an alternate history version of the Chernobyl zone, where the liquidators failed to contain the failing nuclear reactor and a second explosion occurred, rendering a much larger area uninhabitable. It's a remarkably grim and lonely game where you play as an amnesiac mercenary in an overwhelmingly oppressive and cruel world. It's one of those games whose atmosphere is so well engineered that it's immediately distinct and unmistakable. This is where Metro draws its closest inspiration, tonally, because mechanically the two games follow completely different game design ideologies. Stalker is an open-world survival shooter where you trudge around large zones with lots of optional side missions and a loose and slow-burning main story. Metro is a hyper-linear cinematic first-person shooter with stealth and horror elements. It's this hyperlinearity that causes most of the game's shortcomings. It's linear in a way that results in large chunks of this game suffering from really claustrophobic follow-the-leader game design, where you are being guided by someone determined to walk as slowly as the engine allows while they rattle on about whatever the present concern is. The game only opens up occasionally, and when it does, it's absolutely thrilling, but those moments are too far and few between in this first entry to feel wholly satisfying by the end. It's an approach to game design that's suffocating and doesn't take advantage of the medium's uniqueness. It works for the book because that's what books do the best. Artyom, the protagonist, is naive and well out of his depths, going on a hopeless mission in a dangerous and unpredictable world. So naturally, most of the book is Artyom stumbling into an impossible situation and requiring the help of others to succeed. As a game, everything is achievable, and mostly easily, because the cinematic nature of the game makes it very forgiving with checkpoints and scripted sequences. The standard shooter expectations condition you to play like Doom Guy, not like a scared boy. So saddling the player with constant guides feels like a ball and chain that's largely detrimental for gameplay, only carried over from the books as a concession for faithful adaptation purposes. But occasionally, the game opens up and gives the player room to explore on their own, albeit with still pretty linear levels. For a game called Metro 2033, where human survivors are forced to live underground because the surface is so awful, it's ironic that Metro 2033's surface levels are the highlight of the game. I'm gonna go ahead and say that 2033 and Last Light have the best post-apocalyptic visuals that I have ever seen in a game. Fallout can be pretty at times, but it was always a massive open-world series on aging Bethesda engines. Metro 2033 was cutting edge at the time it released, being one of the games alongside Crysis to really pioneer PC graphical standards in the late 2000s. Its landscapes are demolished to a degree unlike any other game out there, with very little surviving architecture, and in this game, all covered with a coat of snow that gives it an even more uninhabitable and dangerous look than in a warmer climate. It's stunningly beautiful, but the most enduringly gorgeous effect is how your gas mask interacts with the surface elements. Rain, slime, and blood will collect on your mask, and it looks incredibly realistic. The way rain trickles down, slime will stick and coat, and blood will splatter and dry is an attention to detail that makes it impossibly atmospheric and immersive. And as your filters need changing, the fog on the mask will slowly increase and your breathing will intensify. All until you feel like you're inside a fishbowl with the mask fog clouding your entire field of view and your breaths become constant and grating. Even taking damage will gradually crack the mask all the way until it breaks, where you need to immediately swap it for a new one. It's not like in most games where you get a super badass power armor helmet and it has no effect on your field of view. Metro never truly lets you forget that you're wearing a piece of fragile plastic over your face in a deadly and exotic landscape. The surface levels have a much slower, more exploration-focused pace, which comes as extremely welcome given the intense linearity of most of the underground levels. It never gives you any true hidden areas per se, but scatters ranger stashes in innocuous places all around the level, as well as safes that need keys in hidden locations. The first couple surface levels, the Dead City and the Outpost, are pretty straightforward, the first being a tour across a good section of the city with monsters in pursuit, and the second being a sneak through a Nazi outpost. The third surface level, the Library, is the peak of the whole game and one of the most memorable levels of the series. This is a level that I think was actually done better than in the book because it expands on and plays with the creative monsters that roam the area in some really effectively creepy ways. This section in the book is memorable but very brief. Artyom and a group of rangers go into the library while searching for a book to help save his home station, when Artyom's companion Daniel is impaled by a librarian who mimics his movements. Artyom shoots Daniel out of mercy and they leave promptly. In the game, Artyom is all alone, and the librarians, a radioactive monster who appears to be mutated from gorillas, stalk him through the upper floors and the lower. The librarians operate on a different mechanical principle than other enemies in the game, by way of having to stare them down instead of running away. If a librarian notices you, you have to hold eye contact like you're in an Oblivion dialogue sequence and slowly back away to a safe position. If you break eye contact, even just by putting a piece of cover between you and the librarian, they will charge until you are pulverized into little chunks. You can kill them, but they take so many shots and are so deadly at close range that it's not even worth it economically. The only option is to avoid them or stare them down as a last resort. The whole sequence is horrifying as the entire building is swarming with them, one after the other, running from room to room. You just feel so exposed and so helpless. More than any other sequence in the game, this is one that takes a part of the book that was a little underdeveloped and expands on it wonderfully, elevating it to something new and definitive for the iconography of the series. Largely, though, its strict adherence to the book is actually a negative thing because it tries to stay as close as possible to the book in a medium that cannot portray the same kind of nuances that a 500-page novel can. The first few chapters of the book are condensed into a 5-minute conversation and gun battle in the game. All of the character building of Artyom and his friends in the station, and his wrestling with the decision to tell his adopted father the truth about him leaving his home station to go to Polis, is almost entirely eliminated. They actually include an optional scene where Artyom can say goodbye to Alex but doesn't tell him the truth anyways. Since this is a game, I think it would have been better if they gave you the option, even though it wouldn't affect anything because, spoilers, Artyom never returns to his home station despite it being one of the best chapters of the book. It's why I think this game would have been better off to just throw Artyom and the player headlong into the journey right from the start, make the story much more minimal, have the first few levels of the game take place inside the dark metro tunnels with nothing but notes to give players context on Artyom and his journey. It would be a lot more intriguing than this paper-thin attempt at cinematically recreating the central points of the story. The most unfortunate thing about the structure of the game is that it painstakingly tries to recreate the structure of the book despite it being the totally wrong genre for the type of story the book is. The book is a foot-by-foot journey of Artyom from one station to the next. Each chapter takes place in a different station with new concerns or new characters that help or hinder Artyom on his journey. It feels very episodic, with each chapter feeling relatively self-contained. New characters are introduced every chapter, only to be left behind and never seen again, with the exception of a couple of the more memorable ones. It's a supremely effective story structure for the book because the book is more about the world and the mood than it is about its central story. It's a lot of long strings of introspective dialogue and local politics. Not exactly the easiest thing to adapt into a first-person shooter game. I think if they wanted to remain super faithful to the book, then a role-playing game with a complicated dialogue system would suit this game a lot better than a Half-Life style naturalistic first-person shooter. Or they should have gone the complete other direction and differentiated it from the book by making it a lonely story about Artyom navigating the metro tunnels without any friendly characters. Different mediums do different kinds of stories better. Books obviously do dialogue a lot better than video games outside of role-playing games because they can feature introspection and nuance through inner thoughts and descriptions, but they struggle a little more at creating mood because the imagination has to do all of the work. In a game, audio and visuals can create a mood much more vividly, and that's why I think a moody, lonely linear first-person shooter would have been better than the current theme park direct adaptation that they've gone for. So enough of what they should have done. How about what's actually here and how good is it? Well, the majority of your time is spent oscillating between the game's three primary gameplay styles: limited exploration, stealth, or combat. I say limited exploration because it's as much exploration that they can fit into these linear levels, which most of the time constitutes putting ammo under some stairs or finding a key to a locked safe. Still fun, and always pretty well balanced with the other styles, but just not all that substantial or innovative. The stealth is a little more complicated. It's got some really good elements, but still feels underdeveloped. I played the Redux version for this video, which uses the updated stealth engine from Last Light. The original game's stealth was extremely clunky. There was no real indication of how visible you were with muddier and less defined lighting and no light indicator added with Redux. And it's the kind of stealth game where if you miss one throwing knife, every guard in the level immediately knows exactly where you are. So the worst kind. Some people actually prefer the original game's stealth mechanics because it makes Artyom feel more like the scared kid he is in the books, compared to the ultimate stealth badass he plays like in Redux. There's definitely an argument there, and I'd agree to a point. I do think the stealth goes too far in the other direction in Last Light in the Redux, but you can make the stealth challenging without it being infuriatingly unpredictable as well. With better guard placement and more tools for stealth besides shoot them with a silenced weapon or hit them with a throwing knife, it could have been a lot better off. What's here isn't terrible, just frivolous and a little too conventional. The combat's mostly straightforward as well, mostly against the monsters on the surface or in the tunnels. What makes it interesting is the emphasis put on resource management, which especially on Ranger Hardcore makes ammo a constant struggle. So Metro offers you a consolation. You have 2 different ammo types to choose from, for the assault rifle anyways. Use your post-war Metro constructed ammo for its ubiquity and cheapness, but suffer lower stopping power as a result. Or use pre-war military grade ammo for maximum damage but at the cost of it being extremely rare. Military grade ammo is actually used as currency in this world, so what they've developed here is a pretty effective risk-reward struggle. Do you save your military ammo for buying better guns, or do you use it for the increased damage against the powerful and deadly monsters on the surface? The answer is not clear on the first playthrough, so it works as intended, but definitely falls apart on later playthroughs when you realize that you can get basically any gun with any combination of upgrades for free as long as you don't mind waiting a little longer and looking around. In the early game, it's definitely useful for buying filters as they are in short supply, but in the mid to late game, upgraded guns and supplies are everywhere and don't require a purchase. The enemies you'll be fighting themselves are where the game trips and stumbles a little bit. Combat against human enemies is fine. It's actually excellent on Ranger Hardcore because the extremely high damage. It turns the game into a mix of Rainbow Six and Stalker, where shots have to be placed extremely carefully and efficiently, both because of how quickly you will die and because of limited resources. But the monsters definitely could have used some more work. In a game so hyper-focused on resource management and quick deaths, it's kind of infuriating that one of its most recurring enemies, the Nosalises, are awful with extremely poor animations that make taking damage feel like an inevitability. They just flop around from right to left, arms flailing wildly, and you take damage at a rate that does not visually connect with the movements they make. They also can take serious punishment and have very unclear death animations. The movement animations are so poor that often when they are ragdolling around after death, it looks almost identical to their attack movements. They are a very frustrating enemy to fight, and you spend a lot of these games dealing with them. The dogs aren't any better, who move so fast that you'll take damage before you even get a whiff of them. The smaller versions are the absolute worst enemies in the game. There's a couple sequences where they crawl out of holes in the ground and charge you, and they are so fast and so small that it's actually easier to just run through these sections instead of taking all the damage. And finally, there's the demons, whose AI is ridiculously inconsistent. Most of the time they just fly around ignoring you, but if they do decide to pursue you, pesky things like walls and trucks won't stop them. They don't seem to have any collision detection and will clip through anything to get you. Metro also has a different approach to difficulty, with higher difficulties adding extra elements beyond the standard pumping up of enemy health. Ranger Hardcore is one of Metro's more unique contributions to the game industry, removing all HUD elements and making resources razor thin. A lot of people love this mode, and the game's own advertising claims that it's the way the game was meant to be played. I'm kinda torn on this mode. I love what it does to the resources. I think it makes it basically perfect. On my first playthrough of Last Light, I had a moment that was so perfect it's hard to believe. On one of the early outdoor expeditions, you are pushed to the bottom of an escalator with a horde of monsters attacking until the door behind you opens. I ran out of everything. Literally everything. My filters were gone, my gas mask was cracked, I was near death with no health packs, and I ran out of bullets for my last gun. I backed into a corner, jumping and swinging my knife in a hopeless attempt to put up a fight, and at the last second, the doors opened and I was pulled into a cinematic where I was rescued by the safety of the Metro. I haven't managed to replicate this since, but I'll always remember that moment because it's what the whole game is supposed to feel like ideally. Even though I've never managed to recreate a moment as perfect as this, resources are still a consistent struggle on Ranger Hardcore, and I would agree that it's fantastic in this regard. However, removing all of the HUD elements is part of the mode that I don't like. It's supposed to make the game feel more realistic. Instead of looking at magical floating numbers to check your inventory, you are instead supposed to look at bullets in the magazine like a real person to see how much ammo you have left. If you hold down the inventory button, you can see your total supplies, which is great. It replicates the sensation of pulling out a backpack to check your supplies. I have no problem with this. Where it fails is where it could have easily been fixed but hasn't been, even with a re-released version of both games. It disables button prompts for specific sequences like mashing E for melee sequences. On the surface, this doesn't seem like a huge deal, there's only a few of them in the game anyways. But it's so annoying because it's hard to tell which of these sequences require input from the player and which don't, because they all look exactly the same. Even worse, there's a part where you roll up to a gate while manning a turret and it asks you to honk the horn, on the normal difficulty. On Ranger Hardcore, it doesn't prompt anything, so I just sat there for a few minutes wondering if the game was broken before looking up that I was supposed to press E to honk the horn. Would it really have been that much trouble to include a voice line where they remind you to honk the horn, or just do it for you? It's stuff like this that makes the mode feel like an afterthought, or like modding survival difficulty into a game that originally didn't have it. What makes it feel even more like they modded survival difficulty into the game is these scripted sequences, like this part where you're on a trolley. You're stuck in this protracted combat sequence with no cover and dozens of enemies to kill at once, which on Ranger Hardcore will kill you in just a couple shots. It just feels so sloppy. Also unique in the gameplay is its moral choice system. It's binary, unfortunately, and most of the time these systems are extremely reductive and end up restricting and conforming the overall game design in a way that waters down the whole experience. Metro 2033 skirts by, just barely, by incorporating some new elements into the system and making it largely feel optional instead of an integral part of the design. The system is hidden, there are no statistics to track, no constant guilting or shaming of the player for playing a certain way, and no experience or karma prompts popping up to tell you what a bad job you are doing. Instead, and I'm not completely sure about this because the statistics are hidden, the system appears to knock off points for killing too many people, but does it in the background, and it doesn't seem to affect the system as much as the specific actions performed in the game. How it works is that the system requires a net sum of moral points accrued over the course of the game for it to determine the ending the player receives. When you perform specific actions, the screen will flash and you will hear a sound like dripping water to let you know that you have earned a moral point.
Beg somewhere else.
Thanks, let's go.
It's unfortunate that some of these actions feel completely arbitrary. You can get a moral point for flicking a guitar string, but I really like the way it makes you feel like you've stumbled on some kind of secret instead of trying to control and direct the way the player does things. It's not perfect because there are certain moments in this game that require you to kill people, and while I like that the game doesn't bombard you with negative prompts, at the same time it's kind of annoying that you have no idea if it really affects anything. There is also no distinction between killing different types of people. If this was Fallout 3, then killing literal Nazis would give you good karma, not bad, so it's hard to tell how the system behaves. Metro 2033's story is a little harder to talk about in detail, because basically the whole thing can be summed up with, the book is better. I hate being that guy, but it's the truth. Pretty much all of the nuance and personality does not survive the transition from the book, and all that is left is the most bare-bones Wikipedia plot synopsis imaginable. Most of this is not surprising. Details are bound to be glossed over when shortening a 500-page book into a 10-hour video game that mostly consists of shooting, when RTM barely even fires a shot in the first book. But it begs the question of why they even tried to include memorable characters with depth if they weren't even going to bother to showcase any of it at all. The characters behave like somebody skimmed through the spark notes for the plot and based their character design off of that, and only that. The most memorable character in the book is Khan, who is defined by a careful, calming demeanor but can also be extremely sharp and dangerous if pushed hard enough. He's with RTM for a long time, longer than almost any other character in the book, and teaches RTM a lot of essential skills for surviving in the Metro, and how to survive the supernatural elements of the tunnel that RTM had a bad run-in with earlier. It's a dynamic that makes him probably the most interesting character in the book, and doesn't carry through to the game at all. In the game, he's essentially mystical Metro magic man. You follow him for a couple chapters where he talks cryptically about nature and anomalies without encountering any other hostile humans at all to demonstrate Khan's viciousness underneath. The point where it absolutely jumps the shark is when Khan starts throwing fireballs at a level 65 dragon and uses a protection spell. Okay, so that doesn't happen, but he does start doing chants like he's a priest in a fantasy RPG to scare away ghosts, so it's basically the same thing. It's ridiculous. They took the one surface level unique thing about Khan and just ran with it, instead of trying to portray the more interesting personality dichotomy from the book. and Artyom's friends and family in his home station are reduced to throwaway minor characters that have about 5 lines or just end up being tour guides than having a personality and affecting Artyom's journey in some way. They even Americanized Melnik and changed it to Miller, which is the English translation, but still, it's weird because they didn't do it for any other characters, even with way more Russian names. Also absent from the book is the surface realities Rangers face in the book, namely the sun and a rather hypnotic fascination with the Kremlin. Because the Metro dwellers have either lived in the Metro their entire lives or long enough to where they have fully adapted to the dim lighting underground, those who venture to the surface can't bear to look at the sun due to blindness as a consequence. So Rangers have to go during the night and either find shelter or retreat back to the Metro before the sun comes up, rather than down like in most post-apocalyptic media. It's a really interesting inversion of the trope, and I think it could have made for some interesting time management mechanics on the surface, outside of the ever-present threat of draining gas mask filters. Obviously, this means the game wouldn't be able to show off its gorgeous renderings of bombed-out Moscow, but they could have found a way to make it work. Maybe have the first few surface levels take place with this mechanic, and then later in the game, reward Artyom with some arcane future technology called sunglasses. Anyways, the other surface element would be a little harder to implement into gameplay, but nevertheless is one of the weirdest and most intriguing parts of the book. That which catching a glimpse of the Kremlin while on the surface will instantly drive a man to his death, hypnotically pulling him all the way to the building itself irresistibly until they meet their fate. It sounds kind of silly, but this is expanded on in one of the later chapters of the book, and I think it could have given the game a little more personality. Metro's final supernatural element turns out to be its thematic throughline in the real central story of the book, the Dark Ones, an advanced sentient race of mutants that threaten Artyom's home station with destruction. They're almost totally absent for the entire book, and the same goes for the game. It does go to the trouble of sprinkling in some hallucination scenes here and there, but the Dark Ones still remain the end goal, not the main focus of the story. This, alongside the library, is one part of the book that the game arguably handles a little bit better in some respects, because the ending of the book feels rushed and like it's suddenly trying to be profound and about something right at the end, without those themes represented in the book up until that point. Artyom and a squad of Rangers go to the surface in search of D6, a missile base that they can use against the Dark Ones. In it, they fight a protoplasmic shapeless monster that turns out to be why the Kremlin holds some hypnotic power over those who catch a glance of it. And after, they go to the top of the tower to launch the missiles. And then Artyom does, only just after realizing the Dark One's true intentions, which was to cooperate and live in peace. The Dark Ones were only unable to communicate without causing damage to humans in the process. Artyom wipes the tears from his face and goes home. The end. The Dark Ones are supposed to be a metaphor, or at least an analog, for humanity lost. That humans couldn't solve their differences peacefully and resorted to destroying the planet and themselves in the process. Artyom is a relatable, everyman protagonist, and having him be responsible for pulling the trigger on the destruction of an entire race is proof that even regular, good, decent people can commit horrible acts due to ignorance and fear. It's not a bad ending. Seeing Artyom go through this transformation is wonderful, and it wraps up most of its loose plot threads in one of the earlier chapters. But it's the sudden introduction of all these heady themes of anti-war, nuclear deterrence, and a longing for peaceful global cooperation that cause a jarring narrative structure. They ultimately feel like they were thrown in as a way to make the book more profound at the last second instead of an integral part of the story. Where the book fails, the game actually succeeds, at least a little bit more, in that it actually gives you the path to comprehend the Dark One's messages and avoid firing the missiles. There's a part in the book that doesn't get brought up in the game when Artyom recalls an experience he had as a child where he snuck to the surface and encountered a Dark One. It established a connection with him, and it's why he's able to comprehend the Dark One's communications more than most people. It makes perfect sense, and I think it's a more satisfying ending and more in line with Artyom's transformation. Artyom doesn't repeat the mistakes of the past. He's been near death so many times. He survived the madness that plagues those in the tunnels. He's been chased at by monsters on the surface and shot at dozens of times. He's even been hanged by a Nazi death squad and lived to tell a tale. It's fitting that he's had enough of death and enough of war to put an end to the cycles of violence that destroyed his world. Ultimately, though, despite a couple of smart changes, Metro 2033 mostly fails as an adaptation of Glukovsky's novel. However, that absolutely does not make it a bad game. almost everything this game tries to specifically adapt from the book, it loses too much of its nuance and depth in the transition. But remarkably, the spirit of the book is still mostly intact. That unmistakable feeling of both creeping, oppressive horror and the thrills of a true adventure, both in the tunnels and on the surface, is transformative and feels like it's ripped straight from the page. I could go on for hours about how this game disappointed me as a fan of the book because of specific details, but I cannot deny that this adaptation is pitch perfect in its mood and its visuals, and that makes it undeniably special and unique. The sequel to 2033, Metro Last Light, goes in a different direction than the first game, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. The shooting mechanics are virtually unchanged despite some minor tweaks, and its level design and structure is identical to 2033. But what it leaves behind is the notion of being an adaptation of a book, because Last Light is 4A Games' own original story, not having any real connection to the series of books. There's 2 sequels to Metro 2033 the book, Metro 2034, which is a bit of a weird prequel thing that focuses on Hunter, the ranger that sets Artyom off on his journey in 2033, and Metro 2035, which brings Artyom back as the protagonist and sees him searching for life outside the Metro. This seems to be what the concept for Metro Exodus is based around. Metro Last Light is an original story, and the developers are able to easily outshine their storytelling efforts in the previous game without the shackles of a much more substantial work to stay faithful to. It takes place sometime after 2033 with the Polis Rangers set up in D6 as their new military base, and Artyom having been inducted into the Order for some time. The weird choice is that Last Light disregards the quote-unquote good ending of 2033 and wipes it from canon. For Last Light, in the series moving forward, Artyom fired the missiles and destroyed the Dark Ones. It's kind of jarring if you go from one game to the next, and I also don't really understand why they did it. The Dark Ones are not the center of the story anymore. This is a much grander story about politics and war. There's only one aspect of this story that would have to be changed depending on the ending, and it would not have been insurmountable to do so. Regardless, the main thrust of the story this time is about how the whole of the Metro deals with the fallout of finding D6, a base with enough resources to keep a population going for decades. The Polis Rangers currently have claim over it, given they were the ones to find it, but the other major factions, the Communists and the Nazis, also want it for themselves. So kicks off a story of betrayal, scheming, and battles, all for the fate of D6 and the whole of the Metro, as opposed to the personal odyssey of Artyom in the first game. Last Light is not as successful in elevating its gameplay beyond its predecessor. At a glance, you'd be hard-pressed to notice the difference, and if you haven't played the games before, I bet you didn't even notice that I used both Last Light and 2033 footage at the beginning of this video. This isn't even a Fallout New Vegas versus Fallout 3 situation either, where the interface and surface of the game remains identical, but it overhauls everything underneath. It plays almost identical to 2033 with some minor changes. The biggest change is to its stealth mechanics, which are superior to 2033 and 2033 Redux, mostly because the game is actually designed around the light indicator and it has bigger environments with better placed guards. That is, for the first few hours, until Last Light has this really cool bug where the prompt for knocking out or killing people for stealth breaks and then doesn't work for the rest of the game. It's really fun. I'm serious. This is the second time this has happened to me on the Redux version, and when you look up if there's a possible fix, there isn't one. You just have to deal with it. So I got the bad ending for killing too many people because I literally have no other option. Thanks, Metro. I think this only applies to the Redux version, so make sure you get the original game if you have the option. Beyond this bug, the stealth is a lot better because of the minor changes, like much more defined lighting, which is crucial for the player avoiding detection in a binary light versus dark system, and environments that have much more thought into how you are supposed to sneak through them. There is an argument to be made about the new lighting cracking the believability of the game a bit when, in your perspective, you are clearly visible yet completely blind to enemies right in front of you because of a mild shadow. The original Metro 2033 had more realistic lighting in this sense, which I do think enhances the mood, but it makes the stealth much more mechanically frustrating as a trade-off. Personally, I'm willing to accept the more painterly approach to lighting for more polished gameplay, but I totally understand those who prefer the original game's realism and mood-first design philosophy. Its combat is less nuanced. It's basically just more of the same. A couple new weapons, a couple new enemy types, yeah, I'd just be repeating myself. It's the standard video game sequel in this aspect. Where it really differs is in its pacing, which is a lot less awkward than the first game. You don't spend nearly as much time with constant tour guides and are given more freedom to explore the levels on your own this time. One of the downsides of the first game is that there really isn't a whole lot of surface levels, which were the highlight of the game. This time around there is a ton. I'd say half of the game is on the surface while the other half is in the metro. With the seasons advanced, the snow has melted, giving Last Slice environments a more luscious and savage appearance than the sterile, desolate look of 2033. But where the visuals and gameplay as a whole really come together is the last third of the game, where Artyom goes on a lengthy journey through 6 surface levels in a row, each one more hauntingly beautiful than the last. There's a bridge with some of the best weather effects I've ever seen in a game, a shadow town that reminds me a lot of Pripyat in Stalker, Red Square with a close-up of the Kremlin but spared of its hypnotic influence, and a radioactive garden at night. It's the most beautiful the series ever gets, and the variety of visuals and gameplay, from being hunted by watchers and demons on the bridge to an ambush on Red Square and boss fight with a mutated bear in the garden, it's what 2033 was missing. A greater amount and variety of surface missions to show off the gorgeous renderings of post-nuclear decay. Where it fails in the gameplay is when it embraces FPS cliches like boss fights and heavily scripted action sequences. There's 2, arguably 3 boss fights in the game, and they are all about as bog standard and uninspired as you can get. The first one in the Catacombs uses the most ubiquitous recycled boss fight mechanic in existence: bait a charging enemy into destroying scenery. You know, the same mechanic that was already old and crusty back when Gears of War 1 did it back in 2006. And the second boss has glowing bits that you need to shoot for damaging it. All it needs is a 10-second QuickTime fight and it would have the trifecta of overdone boss design. The scripted sequences are about the same. They can feel a little out of place in a game like this with these booming orchestral scores and flashy cinematic effects. They're much more elaborate than the ones in the previous games, such as this boat chase where Artyom and a fisherman are being attacked by mutated shrimps. The shrimps have really bad design, and with Artyom trapped on a boat, it becomes almost impossible to dodge their attacks, which makes this one of the hardest sections of the whole series on Ranger Hardcore. The whole time playing this sequence, I imagined how much creepier they could have designed it. Put Artyom on the boat by himself, and maybe add some stealth mechanics with Artyom trying to navigate a boat without detecting the shrimps. Instead, in some areas, they've swapped out creepy, understated horror for bombast, and the tone takes a hit because of it. And this is where most people take issue with Last Light in comparison to 2033, the tone and atmosphere. 2033's tone was a lot darker and a lot more alien, as most of the world was unknown to Artyom. Here, the story is about war and politics. Artyom is no longer that scared kid embarking on a dangerous journey where he's never been before. Now Artyom is a soldier, a ranger of the order, and he has the training and connections to be much more confident in his adventure. The tone follows suit and is much more action-oriented. It's not inherently bad to be an action game, but it is a lot less unique than the first game's blending of survival, horror, combat, and stealth with a fragile and underprepared protagonist. What also changes the tone for the worse is the supernatural elements and art style occasionally, which completely jump the frigging shark in this entry. Now, I like the supernatural elements in these games. I think it adds a lot to the atmosphere and feels totally appropriate and welcome. But Last Light sometimes tries to mix things up visually and thematically, and it's really jarring. This level in the Catacombs feels more like Indiana Jones or Tomb Raider with a completely different set of visual assets. It's like you were going spelunking with everything constructed out of wood and rocks, and it just looks totally out of place compared to the dark, ancient sarcophagus look of most of the other materials in the asset list. And the worst level in the game is the River of Fate, where Artyom is chillin' with Khan when they decide to rip a fat bong hit and then drop some shrooms, yo. No, seriously, this might as well be what happens, because this whole level is an insultingly stupid, hallucinatory drug trip about prophecy and fate. Radioactive monsters, intelligent and feral, ghostly apparitions, flashbacks beamed into consciousness are all tonally consistent, because they all reinforce the horror-based themes and tone of the game. Prophecy and fate are probably the lamest, most overused, and cringe-inducing storytelling tropes out there, and it has no business being in a game like this. The tone has issues, but Last Light's narrative still mostly works and is responsible for making probably its biggest stride over its predecessor. That's not to say it's a great story, but that they've clearly gotten better at creating a story that works in the format of a game over their attempts at adapting the book in 2033. There is some rough transitional edges, like the recasting of Miller and the total change in personality to a warmongering, toughest tough guy leader, Khan becoming even more spiritualistic and hokey, Ullman losing his bad humor from the first game, and the new character Anna treating Artyom like dirt and a nobody after he, along with Miller and the other Rangers, bombed all the Dark Ones, which should make him a hero in this world. But where it really succeeds is in making the Metro feel like a more developed, involved place than the first game. New settlements like the theater and Venice show off a culture to the world that wasn't really seen previously. It's still very much in tune, feeling very cramped, and like buildings are built on top of and around each other to make the most use of its limited space. But getting to see an actual theater performance, as well as how art critics survive in the post-apocalypse, makes the world feel so much more believable. The factions this time around also play a much larger role than in the first game, being involved in grander schemes and plots that affect the whole of the Metro. The Nazis have a much greater fighting force and are even operating a death camp that Artyom is sent to at the beginning of the game. They look like they might be developing as a major faction in the Metro, and this early level foreshadows them as the major antagonist of the series, but instead that distinct honor goes to the communist Red Line this time around. The gold rush for D6 means that every faction wants a piece, and they are all set to divide resources during peace talks set towards the end of the game. But the communists have an elaborate plan involving sleeper agents, chemical weapon, and stealth attacks to take everything for themselves. There's some foreshadowing early on when Rangers mentioned that someone named Lesnitsky is missing, along with the contraband he was supposed to be guarding, an unknown biological agent or chemical weapon. That weapon is deployed later on by the communists in an attempt to gain political capital in the peace talks to come. They purposefully infected a station with an agent designed for maximum lethality within a short time, and then dissipates so that their crews can sweep in and take credit for stopping the disease. And then during the peace talks, attack the Rangers while they are distracted and take D6 for themselves. It's in this communist war machine that Last Light unveils its most considerable improvement in storytelling. It has this series' first three-dimensional believable character. Pavel is your companion for the first third of the game. After failing to capture the Dark One in the opening mission, Artyom is captured by a group of Nazis along with a squad of communists as well. Pavel and Artyom narrowly escape execution in the Nazi death camp, and Pavel promises to take Artyom to another station where they can contact Polis, Artyom's home station where he can update them on the mission. Pavel's a fully red-blooded communist and has committed himself fully to their system and their beliefs, which technically makes him and Artyom enemies. But his choice to team up with Artyom is a surprisingly relatable and believable one.
Our superiors are not on the best of terms, huh? But I say fuck that. No, fuck that. The grunts stick together, huh? The fuck?
Camaraderie among the common soldiers is a good choice, and this line makes Pavel's friendliness seem genuine, although there's always a fair amount of suspicion under the surface. Eventually, though, that suspicion rings true once Pavel leads you to a red station and brings you into his superiors under orders. The thing about it, though, is that Pavel's friendliness still seems genuine. Even when you are being led to being tortured, Pavel doesn't seem to enjoy it, even when the ruse is no longer intact. That's because Pavel's affection for Artyom is in fact genuine, but as a soldier, he considers his orders and his cause more important than someone he really does consider a friend. So in further interactions, his attitude changes towards playful taunting. Not in an I'm an arrogant, evil, bad guy and I'm gonna rub it in your face type of way, but in the same way you mess around with your friends that you've known for long enough to where it becomes socially acceptable to demean and shame them. It's surprisingly sympathetic and nuanced, which stands out in the writing of this series. It does become harder to sympathize with Pavel once his role in the communist war machine is revealed, being in coordination with some of the war crimes committed throughout the game, such as the virus attack about 2/3 of the way. But I was never able to fully write him off because of the real companionship with Artyom. Eventually, Pavel's squad ambushes Artyom in Red Square, and Artyom gets the advantage on him. No anger, only sadness, your Dark One companion tells you. Pavel truly did not want to fight Artyom, but his orders compelled him to. It's a really interesting inversion of the typical nemesis trope. Normally, video game nemeses develop into a main villain that are designed to make you hate them as much as possible. Pavel is one of those rare characters on opposite sides of the battlefield that fights you from a personal reluctance instead of gleeful brashness. The best part is that you are given the choice to forgive him, or not, depending on how you see it. You can view it either as a personal choice or a broader ethical choice given the awful things he has done in the name of the Red Line. Pavel was able to separate his friendship with Artyom from his orders and his duty. The game is asking if you will do the same, or if you are willing to overlook that in order to forgive a friend in the hopes that he will come around. But despite this brief respite of goodwill and hope, the war the communists have set into motion is unstoppable. The final act of the game is a big battle between the last of Miller's Rangers and the invading communist forces. It's actually used as the graphics benchmark for the game, and it's hard not to see why. It's one of the most incredible looking sequences I've ever seen in a PC game. The photorealistic lighting of the fire illuminating the dark tunnel, the dozens of NPCs invading at a time, and the explosion and gunshot effects still look amazing, even 5 years later. Artyom and Miller are outnumbered, so it's only a matter of time before they are overwhelmed, and they are when a train comes crashing through their defenses, killing almost all of the remaining Rangers and leaving Artyom and Miller badly wounded. But from here, the story can go two very different ways depending on how the player acted up to this point, similar to the first game. Because that lone Dark One Artyom finds in the beginning was in fact alive and able to establish communication with Artyom, Artyom chooses to take him to the peace talks to try and avoid war when the Dark One finds out that an entire population of his kind is housed in a locked bunker in D6. Wait, what? Yeah, I don't understand this at all. The Dark Ones are a post-war creation. How is there a surviving population inside of a locked pre-war bunker? The Dark Ones are capable of some pretty incredible things, but I don't think teleportation beyond a few feet at a time has ever been established as being possible. Basically, it's just a way to make up for running with the bad ending from the last game. Last Light uses a hidden moral choice system similar to 2033, where the amount of people Artyom killed and how many moral points he accrued over the course of the game will determine which ending the player receives. Only this time, the two endings are a little more nuanced. The quote-unquote bad ending is not straightforwardly a downer. Artyom triggers a bomb and blows up the rest of the invading communist forces as well as himself and what remains of the Rangers. He still wins, just at the cost of himself and so many others. But if you have enough moral points to trigger the quote-unquote good ending, then the Dark Ones do what Artyom could not, see past their differences and save Artyom and the Rangers from the invasion without any bloodshed. The living Dark Ones find a new home on the surface and live in peace, presumably. I like both endings this time around. They found a way for Artyom to win either way, and change how he does it based on the player's actions, instead of one ending feeling like you lost and like you messed something up. But at the same time, I don't really know if me liking both endings is really a good thing. The original game's ending carried over from the book was uniquely dour, even if it wasn't as satisfying as sparing the Dark Ones. It had something to say, and even though that message was still jumbled and rushed, it's still an achievement in itself for video games because of how rarely they try to be culturally significant. These endings don't really have anything to say. One is a traditional action ending, the other is basically post-nuclear ET. And this really encapsulates everything Last Light is about. It's a more technically competent sequel that does a lot right that the first game got wrong on the surface, but somewhere along the way, it lost a bit of its soul and became more generic and less unique along the way. It sanded down the series' rough edges to create something much more playable and much more comparable to other games on the market for better or for worse. The series continues today with Metro Exodus, which releases next month and seems to be going back to 2033's roots as an adaptation of another book in the series, Metro 2035. I'm really looking forward to playing it and figuring out how it'll address the series' fundamental design questions. Is being faithful to its inspiration inherently positive? And how does the series move on without totally disrespecting that inspiration? I can't wait to find out.